coming apart here. If I can get this thing back the way it's supposed to be. There, excuse me. It's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about my book. I also appreciate the opportunity to be able to give something back to the Department of Archives and History. This place has meant a huge thing to me in my life, it's going back to 65 or 6, somewhere along there. When I first got interested in doing research, I come over here and I'm trying to get oriented now to this new section, but you went in off of a side street, and in the Civil Archives section was this kind of dingy, dusty corner that William Ledford was the curator for it. I don't know if there's anybody around to remember him or not, but I developed a relationship with him over the years, and I could come in and there was no sign-in or membership numbers or any of this. I just go back in the stacks and help myself, and it was a wonderful thing that you can no longer do. So you don't get to have that privilege, and I don't either anymore, and that's probably a good thing. This book is about baseball, the Negro Southern League, which was a minor league that operated in the South for over 30 years. Baseball is largely believed to have come south during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, probably with Union soldiers playing pickup games or something of that sort. It caught on. Of course, it was in a developmental stage then. It caught on, and Henry Grady, the famous New South newspaper editor in Atlanta, he organized a group of businessmen who formed the Southern League. And this was in 1885, the following year, some black businessmen formed the league with the wonderful name of the Southern League of Colored Baseballists. And this was in Jacksonville, Florida. The teams that were in that, to be in that league, were Jacksonville, New Orleans, Memphis, Atlanta, and Savannah. Nothing much came of it. And there were one or two other efforts like that, but that was the earliest effort by African Americans to form a baseball league. The white Southern League struggled for about 15 years there in the 1880s and 1890s. Some years it operated, some years it couldn't complete a season. I think one year they were decimated by a yellow fever epidemic in a couple of the cities. And but it formed the basis for 1901 when the Southern Association was formed. And the Southern Association lasted 60 years, closing in some large measure because owners in some cities were unwilling to integrate in the 60s. The Southern Association figures into the Negro Southern League also because the same ballparks were used by both the white and black teams in different cities. In fact, Chris Fullerton, who wrote a book on the Birmingham Black Barons, he called his book Every Other Sunday, which was essentially said that if the white team is in town this week, you got to find somewhere else to play. And so they usually would alternate home and road, or a lot of them did in like that. There were black players in the 1880s, 90s that played in the white leagues, some of them with notable success. Fleetwood Walker was one, Bud Fowler, who played for over 20 years, managed some, and in 1896 was reported to be organizing a team called the London Creole Giants out of Muncie, Indiana. They were going to travel all over the country barnstorming and would challenge anybody for the colored championship, as it was at that time. Well, in 1920, in February, in Kansas City, at a YMCA, a group of black businessmen organized the Negro National League, which was the first concrete effort at organization in baseball. It brought about to fruition a goal that Rube Foster, Frank Leland, and other men had had for a long time. The teams that were in that first year, Chicago American Giants, Indianapolis ABCs, Chicago Union Giants, Kansas City Monarchs, St. Louis Giants, Detroit Stars, Dayton Marcos, and Cuban Stars. And within a month, at a meeting in Atlanta, black businessmen in the South organized the first Negro Southern League. I don't know if they were inspired by what happened in Kansas City. It's not unreasonable to expect that. When they had the meeting in Atlanta to organize it, the cities that sent representatives were Knoxville, Chattanooga, Nashville, Greenville, South Carolina, Birmingham, Montgomery, Pensacola, Jacksonville, New Orleans, and Atlanta. All of those cities except Greenville off and on had teams in the Negro Southern League as it operated. As I said, both of these leagues in 1920 and 3 years later, the Eastern Colored League is formed up along the Atlantic coast, and it operated until about 1931 or so. The Negro Southern League was very peripatetic. It was here, and then it was gone and back again. It operated from 1920 to 23, 26, 27, 29, 31, 36, and then ceased operations until 1945. After the war, it resumed again. 1923 is a little bit interesting in that Birmingham and the Memphis Red Sox, the Birmingham Black Barons, were incredibly dominant that year. In fact, the only teams that they seemed to lose to were each other when they played each other. And when the first half of the season ended, it was a common practice in those days to have a split season. You'd play up till July the 4th, you'd have a champion for then, and then you'd play the rest of the summer and have another champion and perhaps a playoff between those two. But when the first half ended, Birmingham and Memphis applied for and were granted membership in the Negro National League for the second half of the season, and the Southern League just evaporated. There was, with the two teams that good gone, there was nothing left for them. The Negro Southern League was a minor league. It was like the Southern League or any of these other, like that the Biscuits are in. It was a minor league. It had so-called major league status 1 year, and that was 1932. In the height of the Depression, there are all kinds of economic fallouts going on, and all of the other leagues folded except the Negro Southern League. And so therefore, it has been by historians accorded a major league status for 1932. The Negro Southern League, as I said, was a minor league, but it did send a number of players up to what you would call higher classifications, the Negro National League, and then later the Negro American League, sent a number of players on up to this higher level. These players were coming out of steel mills in Birmingham and cotton fields all over the South. The Southern League gave them an opportunity to play baseball in cities where they could not have been in one of these higher leagues that couldn't have supported it. The two most recognizable names probably of the ones who went up are Satchel Paige and Willie Mays. Both of them started in Chattanooga. In 1926, Satchel Paige was with the Chattanooga White Sox. And contrary to all you've heard about the great Satch, he did not pitch a no-hitter every game. He did not lose. He did not win every game. Part of the fun of this was compiling information in situations like this. He broke even his first year. He was about 9-9, something like that. And This is based on what I could put together, finding box scores, finding line scores, even results, just results of games could be extremely difficult in some years. But he went up. Willie Mays, still a student at Fairfield Industrial High School, went to Chattanooga and played with the Chattanooga Choo-Choos in the 40s. And, of course, both of them are in the Hall of Fame. There are three other Hall of Famers who were also Negro Southern League players: Hilton Smith, Turkey Stearns, and Mule Suttles. The Negro Southern League broke both gender and disability barriers, which was fun to research. There's been a biography and a lot of information about Toni Stone, who played with New Orleans and as the first woman in baseball. She was the first to have a career. She was not the first woman to play in Negro leagues. In fact, there were four ahead of her. The first was a young lady named Georgia May Williams, 5'6", 105 pounds. She started a game for Chattanooga against Little Rock in 1945, struck out the first batter she faced, and was immediately replaced by a regular pitcher for the rest of the game. They had pulled in the crowd. I guess they wanted to see her play at that point. A couple of years later, Alan Page, a hotel man in New Orleans, had a cashier who was athletically gifted. Her name was Lucille Bland, and he put her in uniform as third base coach. Obviously, again, you're looking at attendance building with these kinds of things, but one newspaper reporter said she gives an active and fiery demonstration of her enthusiasm. And Bland herself was quoted as saying, "I'd get right in an umpire's face and let him have it." But she was injured in a car wreck a couple of years later and did not return to the field. New Orleans signed a couple of other women in 1948, but neither one was really considered that much of an athlete. It was pretty much a drawing card for attendance. Excuse me a second. During World War II, in the white leagues, of course, your manpower shortage is drastic because so many, anybody able-bodied is in service. People today have no concept of what a totality of our lives World War II was. They just cannot visualize the rationing and all of these other things. But every family was touched by that war. Baseball was touched in a big way. It gave an opportunity for a man named Pete Gray, who had lost an arm as a child in Pennsylvania, to play some minor league baseball and was even signed by the St. Louis Browns, getting into 77 games in 1945. Well, the Negro Southern League was ahead of the major leagues on this. They had a player named Forrest One Wing Maddox. People were not terribly kind in those days and not politically correct about disabilities, but Wing had a career of about close to 10 years in the Negro Southern League. He had lost his left arm as a child, and there's a photograph in the book of him in a position like this, swinging this bat with his right hand. When he was in the field, he had a couple of ways he caught the ball. He would catch the ball, flip it, and then drop the glove or stick the glove under the nub, grab the ball as it came back down, and throw it in. He had a really good arm, right arm, and he nailed base runners at home plate more than once. These were documented in game accounts that I ran across. He had a good arm, but I suppose these guys probably also thought, this old crippled boy out there is not going to get me out, so, you know, they're kind of loping in there. But he was a very good ball player. He pitched. He also played outfield. He's probably my favorite player, I guess, that I ran across in putting all of this together. Another one that it was fun to discover, of course, talking about Page's early career, and how he was good, but not necessarily invincible. I also discovered Willie Mays, his father, playing in Birmingham in 1936, I believe it was. And this was one of the years where I found a number of box scores. I was able to get 9 in which Cat Mays had played, and he had something like 280 or something like that. He was a respectable ball player. My work was, although I interviewed some players, my work was largely in newspaper files, which I guess is because of my background, I don't know. But I looked at thousands, literally thousands of newspapers, more than 100 different titles, 20 states, the District of Columbia, microfilm, dusty bound volumes, flipping through these things. And that was my primary resource. And part of this was because I was really writing about baseball, the game, much more than the sociology of the times. I think that has been adequately dealt with, the long bus rides, lack of places to stay, having to go to restaurants and eat out the back door. All of these horrible things that were part of the picture then are there. But I wanted to showcase some ball players that nobody would ever know anything about. I didn't feel like, for example, we need yet another biography of Satchel Paige. There must be a dozen out there. So this has been done. It was a lot more fun for me to find out about people like Wing Maddox and some of them like that. That first year in the league, there was a pitcher called Steel Arm Dickey. And this guy pitched 2 no-hitters during the season. One was against a semi-pro team, one was against the league team, and he had a record of 25 consecutive wins. Now, of course, what they didn't distinguish completely that they were all league games. For example, he might played against a semi-pro team like one of his no-hitters was, but still, 25 straight games is pretty good. It was fascinating to me. These were the days when men were men. You didn't have 5 or 6 relief pitchers in every inning. These were men. And I ran across more than one occasion where 2 pitchers would pitch 13 innings in a game that lasted that long, both of them going the entire game. And it's just incredible to me that they could stand up after that. I got into this, as I said, I started coming to the archives in the 60s. When I moved to Anniston and was working at the Anniston Star, people talked about Ty Cobb had played in Anniston. And so I got fascinated with that. And that was my first research project, was Ty Cobb. And I came down here and looked at those old dusty bound volumes of the Anniston Star and the other paper in Anniston that had the wonderful name of the Hot Blast, and so I researched Ty Cobb, and what that did played out later with this book too. I discovered that what had been printed about Ty Cobb in Anniston was almost totally incorrect, and so I was able to put it in the right perspective on that. Even the name of the team he played for was incorrect at that time. The name of the league was incorrect. And it was great fun putting that together, and it kind of opened the door for me to do similar type research in high school sports. History, I was not a history major. I was a journalism major. But at the University of Alabama in the 60s, the history department there was so good. I got so fascinated with it that I took almost enough hours to have had a minor if I'd gone to the trouble of declaring it or something. And history has remained a huge part of my life since then. But when I was in Anniston in 1970, a book came out called Only the Ball Was White. And any Negro Leagues researcher who came along in the 70s, 80s, and even early 90s probably was affected by that book. I have not known any of them who were not brought into the fold by reading Bob Peterson's book. And it just opened up this whole world that nobody knew anything about. And in 1971, the year after it came out, the Society for American Baseball Research was formed. The Negro Leagues Committee came right after that. I was not a charter member, but 6 or 8 of the researchers that I had come to know at that point were all charter members, and I was in the second tier of people to join after that. And then we had started having conferences and conventions with the Negro Leagues Committee, and I was very fortunate that in 1998 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I was able to meet Bob Peterson and thank him for the seminal influence he had on my life with his book as far as my research activities are concerned. Harrisburg, by the way, if you ever get up that way, the baseball field sits on an island in the middle of the Susquehanna River. It's a really cool setting. It's a footbridge you can go over to get out to it there. The thing that I got into also with this was the Negro Southern League was mine. Nobody else seemed to have any interest in this, and the idea of sort of creating something myself or putting it all together myself was very important from an egotistical standpoint. But I said it had a profound effect on other baseball teams. The Birmingham Black Barons came out of there, the Nashville Elite Giants, Memphis Red Sox, a lot of others came out of there, and there were the things that you would run across, like these 13-inning games and things like that. The minor leagues have always had much more interesting history in some regard than the major leagues have had. For example, in 1923, an Alabama boy named Ike Boone was playing San Antonio in the Texas League. That season, he led the Texas League in runs, hits, total bases, extra bases, doubles, triples, home runs, RBIs, and batting average. There has never been such a performance anywhere by anybody. And another Alabamian with an extraordinary minor league record was Bob Reisner. Some of you may know him. He coached at Montevallo and at Livingston State. I have a hard time saying University of West Alabama. I'm old. But he coached over there too. But in 1957, Bob was pitching for Alexandria in the Eventual League down in Louisiana, and his record that year was 20-0, which was so. The minor leagues have a lot of these. There was digressing from the Negro Southern League, but it reminds me of another story. A guy named Hal Tonis, who was an Alabama native that had a cup of coffee in the major leagues, and he once won a game as a pitcher without throwing a pitch. And what happened is they were trailing, and he was brought in as a relief pitcher. In the last inning, there's a runner on first base, and they're trailing in this game. Tonis comes in, whirls to first and picks off the runner and ends the inning. His team scored and won in the bottom of the inning, and so he got in Ripley's, believe it or not, winning a baseball game without ever throwing a pitch to a batter. But anyway, the Negro Southern League, the only statistics that exist are ones that I compiled. There were no others. The league never published any. They never published, well, they did publish standings from time to time, but I never found a set of standings that could be proven mathematically. Now, what that means is when you add up all of the wins, they have to match all of the losses in equal numbers. There was never a set of standings in which that was the case. You would find 30 more wins than losses when you would start totaling up these columns. And I never attempted to try to do standings because there were so many games were missing. But with individual statistics, if I could get 40 or 50, 60 box scores, I could put together a representative presentation for individual athletes that way, and I did a lot of that. The league operated in a very strange fashion too, and this was throughout black baseball. This was not just the Negro Southern League. You'd find this at all levels. Season opens, great fanfare, parades, all kinds of things. First half is all very exciting. Second half, they have a schedule, but the teams spend as much time on the road barnstorming as they do playing league games. And so again, you get into a situation where you don't have any way to compile actual standings for the second half of the season. The great fanfare opening a game, I remember one of the things I thought was so cool for one of the teams, I think it was in Arkansas or Louisiana, they turned loose a bunch of chickens, and whoever caught the chickens could have them. Well, think about it. This is the Depression. It was pretty good for somebody to be able to do that, you know. And the problem with the box scores, though, what I would find was that you never knew how a player might be presented in a box score. To give you an example, Birmingham had a long-time, really great infielder named Buford Meredith. His nickname was Geechee. Now, I don't know if that comes from his family having Carolina coastal connections, or if it was just a dialect thing from the way he talked, but he was Buford Geechee Meredith. He showed up in box scores as Buford, as Geecher, as Meredith, and he's not the only one like that. Players were quite likely to show up by nicknames, and if you didn't know who they were, didn't know what those nicknames were, then you weren't sure that you had the same athletes involved in that kind of a situation. In fact, this kind of thing was so bad that a man named Raymond Drake, who wrote an article in 1929 for the Associated Negro Press talking about what a terrible job the owners did in providing statistics, providing information on players who had moved from one team to another or any of that sort of thing. He said it was disrespectful to the fans to not provide this kind of information so they could keep up with what was going on. Those issues remained unresolved a dozen years later when the sports editor of the Atlanta Daily World wrote a blistering indictment of the club owners for the same sort of thing. This man had the most wonderful name, Lucius Melancholy Jones. God, I love that name. But he was a good writer, that's that. But he talked about the absence of box scores, contracts being broken all the time, this kind of thing. And one of the ones he blasted the most was Satchel Paige, arguably the game's biggest star at that time, and he called Paige the worst club jumper and rules breaker of them all. Well, is that true? Before that season was out, Satchel had played for 4 different teams. Somebody else offered him another $5 a game or whatever, and he's gone. And this was not an uncommon practice. But, you know, if you're in that environment and you're playing with that kind of uncertainty, you can kind of understand a little bit of it, too, if somebody else. And it was not just black players. It was, I interviewed a guy named, Jake something. I was over in Roanoke. And I was having this interview with him about his baseball career, and he said, I got kicked out such and such a year because that was the first time I jumped the club. I said, excuse me? And this guy had spent his whole career jumping teams in the middle of the season just to get another 50 cents a game or whatever, and was actually suspended at one time from baseball for this sort of thing. So what I did not do in the book is, and I realize I'm kind of jumping around, I did not make any effort at political correctness. I reported it as it was reported in the context of the times. And I think a fascinating thing I ran across was that some of the terminology that appeared, the black writers were as prone to things that we would call politically incorrect today as white writers were. And one of them that I ran across in the Atlanta Daily World, the sports writer, commenting on a pitcher's ineptness in the game the night before, said, he was wilder than a Comanche squaw with her first bottle of gin. And Emory Jackson, who was editor of the Birmingham World, one of Alabama's really fine black journalists over the years, he would refer to the black barons as our dusky-skinned boys, sooty baseball, tan-skinned barons, tar-dipped horse hiders. He also called the white team the milk-skinned barons at times. And they would refer to, he described one of the players as the lemon-skinned third sacker. You know, none of these things would be acceptable today. But in the context of the tearing up this microphone here, of the book, I left things as they were because I figured people can understand what's being said in that regard there. But these guys were baseball players, and they were serious about the game. And to give you an example of that, in 1920, on August the 20th, at all of the Negro League games, play was stopped for 3 minutes, just as it did at the white ballparks, in honor of Ray Chapman, the guy who had been killed, hit by a pitch ball and killed in a major league game a little bit earlier than that. So, and then when the Rainbow Division came to Birmingham about that time for its annual convention, the Birmingham News urged the soldiers to go out to Rickwood Field for a doubleheader that was going to be played, and reported, don't think you will go out and see a gang of raw-boned Negroes attempting to play a game of the national sport. They play it according to Hoyle. So there was a respect for the way that the game was played. I will give you one anecdote of some of the things that are embarrassing to think about now. There was a film crew going into New Orleans to do some film on the fans there, particularly women who would get overly excited for their home team there, and they referred to this as Octavius Roy Cohen stuff. If any of you have ever read any of his short stories or whatever, they're all in dialect. But one thing happened in Atlanta that was positive. In 1936, the Atlanta team put an overhang over a walkway where the black fans would go to walk from the ticket office to the bleachers where they were relegated to sit, because these rednecks would stand up on the top row of this and spit on them as they walked along. And so the Atlanta Ball Club, knowing that the primary color in the world is green, not black or white, put this overhang there to protect the fans, and the newspaper, the black paper in Atlanta, expressed gratitude over that. And I think we should too. Anything? I'm about talked out. I'll be glad to answer any questions if anybody. Yeah.
If you please raise your hand, we'll either Georgia Ann or myself will bring you the microphone, just so you know.
2 quick questions, if you will. First of all, you talked about club jumping. Did they, honest to goodness, have contracts?
Oh, yeah, there were contracts, but, you know, who's going to enforce them in those kinds of environments,
today, yes.
You know, yeah.
And were they able to earn a living playing ball? You referenced their barnstorming the second half of the season. I'm assuming that probably paid better.
Yeah, it probably did. Most ball players, white and black, had other jobs in the off season. Buford Meredith, who was one of my favorites, he played with Birmingham for about 10 or 12 years. Excuse me. He got killed in a coal mine accident in 1932. Just before the season, when they had the so-called major league status, he was electrocuted. And I went over to the health department in Jefferson County. Once I found the date of his death, I went over to see if I could get a copy of the death certificate. And the lady said, "Are you related?" I said, "No, I'm just a friend of the family." And that's one thing, speaking of family, in putting this book together, I have rosters as much as I could put together for every year, and this has filled in a lot of blank years in the lives of and careers of a lot of these ball players. But if you go to baseballreference.com or some of those things and you look up some of these guys, you'll see blank years. Well, some of those book years are in here now. They've been found. Yes?
2 quick questions. When were you at Tuscaloosa News?
I went there in 1970 and left in 76.
Oh, you were a little late. You didn't have to put up with Jim Ward and Paul Davidson, did you?
I knew Paul. Oh, yeah, Paul was a good.
Second question, University of West Alabama, or Livingston as I know it. Reisner, didn't he win a national championship with his baseball team while he was at Livingston?
I don't think he won a national championship.
I was thinking in his group he did.
I don't think he did. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Ty Cobb, doing some research on Ty Cobb, whatever. Everything you read about him, as far as his race, I just wondered if you ran into that in your research.
No, what I was researching at that time was, of course, just what he had done in Anniston, and the interesting thing was, to me, was all the errors and inaccuracies that appeared in his autobiography. It was practically all of it was wrong, other than having been in the city of Anniston. Everything that he put in there was wrong. And
I have a question. You mentioned the owners at one point. Would the owners of these teams have been white, or would they have been African American?
They were mostly black. Now, I ran into this. I'm back trying to finish up a book on the Birmingham Black Barons that I had started prior to this, and I just ran into that in 57 or so. The ownership changed for the first time to white ownership, and there was unhappiness, as you might expect, in the community about that, and to try to offset it, the Birmingham owners hired a minister named Gatemouth Brown, who had a career as a singer. He had been a very, very good singer and had a career at that before he found the Lord, or the Lord found him, however it turned out there, and he became an evangelist. But they hired him to be their upfront person, and he lasted for a few months and then decided it was taking too much away from his church, and he dropped the job. But yeah, mostly they were black up until that point, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Bill. I'm curious. When you did your research, what did you find to be the most reliable source of information?
Well, I said most of it was in newspapers. And if you got a report on a ball game, I think it's pretty accurate for the most part, and a lot of times you can coordinate it between the two different cities in some situations like that. But that was just pretty much what I did. I did some interviews, but the thing is I learned this doing high school football research years ago. I never would accept a score that somebody remembered. because I can't even remember last year's scores, and people are telling me they remember one from 30 years ago. If I couldn't substantiate it through a newspaper story or a yearbook or something, I didn't include it in any of my books. I would just say who won or who lost the game. But is that helpful here?
Are any of the players still alive? And if so, when you were doing your research, were you able to interview any of the players?
I did interview a few, but not in recent years. It's probably, well, I still see a few, but there are a few in Birmingham, and they have gatherings every so often, and some of these guys show up there and you get to talk to them. But these are the ones who are still around today are the ones who came in on the tail end of it when it was all beginning to collapse. See, Jackie Robinson destroyed the Negro Leagues. Now, you think about it in this context. Here, all of a sudden, you have this man who has reached the pinnacle. Now, do you really care that much here? You want to know what's happening to him every day. And if you look at the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, any of these papers, starting from the time that Jackie is signed, you see the coverage of the leagues go like this, and everything's focused on him. It's focused on Larry Doby and the other players who were signed after that. And so and then, of course, you've got television coming in, too, not to make this a one thing here. Television comes in, and all of a sudden you've got ball games that can be watched without having to go to a ballpark, too. So that was part of it.
I have a question here. As it relates to where the ball players actually came from, what was the role of collegiate baseball, especially in HBCUs? How did that play a role into these guys getting on a team, specifically like the Montgomery Blue Sox?
Probably Atlanta experienced it more than anywhere else because you had Morris Brown over there, and you had Morehouse and Atlanta University, and there were several years where the Black Crackers had a very heavy collegiate roster. And, of course, people in those days didn't pay that much attention to all the rules and everything. These guys would they would join the Black Crackers as soon as the college season was over, and then the following year they're back playing at Morehouse again or wherever they happened to be at that time. And there was some of that in Louisiana, but I noticed it mostly in Atlanta.
One other question. There was a team here in Montgomery, the Blue Sox. I think they won like a championship one year. And where did they play, specifically in Montgomery?
I'm not familiar with them. The Gray Sox is what I'm familiar with here.
Yeah, the Gray Sox, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, they played in a lot of different places. They played in a lot of different places. There were several parks, and they're noted in the books. The Alabama State campus was one location they played, and in fact, the Birmingham Black Barons used ASU campus for spring training a number of years. They would come down, and that's where they'd have their spring training. It was out there.
I have a question about the sports writers who are reporting on the games, and if you could speak, just do they describe the character of black baseball as, you know, a more exciting game with more base stealing? Could you speak to that, the character of the baseball being played?
I did not notice that kind of distinction. Almost all of the reporting was straightforward. I found one or two instances where the writers felt like there was an element of humor here in what these people were doing. And you got to realize, too, that there was a certain amount of showmanship with a few of the players. And like Paige, you know, how he tell the outfield to sit down while I face this batter. Some of this kind of showmanship that's going on there. But almost, I think I found one or two articles that sort of were taken in a fun, poking way at it. Everything else was straightforward. This was a baseball game. Here's what happened. And if there were great moments in the game, they were cited just like if it had been the local white team there. But baseball was the national pastime. it mattered to people in those days. I mean, you didn't have TV, you didn't have that kind of thing. Basketball was something that happened between football and baseball. So, you know, you have to put it in that context, I think.
Hello. I want to know if you plan to have a second edition, because I know there's some edits that need to be done. Like my dad played for the Montgomery Gray Sox.
Oh, terrific.
Yes.
Well, I don't know whether there is or not, but I'd be interested in knowing about it.
Okay, thank you.
I think that this is a starting point.
My dad said that he used to attend the Black Baron games in Birmingham. Was that common? And if so, where did the white folks sit?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was very common. In almost every city where I would research, if there was a pre-game article about these teams are going to play tonight or play tomorrow or whatever, there would be a reference to white sitting being available there. Money was money. You know.
All right, do we have another question? Oh, here we go.
What was the main transportation for these folks to go between cities?
Automobiles, trains.
Trains?
You had some with buses, but there'd be a lot of piling into a couple of automobiles. And I ran across a number of situations where games had to be canceled because one of the cars had broken down on the road between cities or something like that. And there were trains. Even the railroads, of course, did a lot of excursions for all kinds of events in the 20s and 30s. And even occasionally, if there was a big series coming up, playoff or something like that, there might be an excursion that ran from, say, Memphis to Birmingham or something like that with special rates.
Mr. Plott, how long did it take you to, over a 30-year period, to pull all this archival material?
Well, I guess I started in 1970 when I looked through Peterson's book and I saw references to the Black Barons and the Gray Sox. And I guess I essentially started then, and it's gone on from there.
We have time for one last question. If anybody has one, raise your hand. All right. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for coming, and let's give it up for Bill Plott one more time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.